It's a real pleasure to be here and talk to you about a collaboration that Heidi and I are working on in Toronto to try to think differently about the future of collaboration in the space of imaging and radiology and image-guided intervention and many other things. And so we decided to put a slide talk together and cover off different domains. And I'm going to start at a very high level and really highlight the fact that, as we've heard today in the presentations, there's a lot of change. And I think when there's this much change going on, it's so close to who we are and what we do, we should really step back. And that's what the talk's about, step back and have a different perspective on where we should go moving forward. And I'll start very high, and I really appreciate Narendra's comments at the beginning and centering the purpose on why we do all this work. I mean, it's great to do some physics and to discover work with some neat equations and make some machines, but at the end of the day, the objective is to advance care through science and technology development and understanding. And if you think about the expectations of healthcare, they're just climbing. With patient-specific customized therapy, we heard about the theranostics paradigm, a degree of customization that's just off the charts. The idea that we want minimally invasive interventions and ultrasound systems that let us target with no harm. Actually, very little tolerance to the idea of toxicity associated with intervention. These are just the expectations that are coming up around us. We also need to be efficient in the province of Ontario. We spend a lot of money on healthcare, and you know how tight things are, so efficiency is important. And moving on to customer satisfaction, accountability, access, and metric reporting, and also engaging the patient, and from a perspective of a support for the family and so on and so forth. Simultaneously, we have great ideas in the labs, and we have to figure out how to get those into the clinical setting. So it's a real challenging domain moving forward. And of course, we're all learning. And it's great that we have a multidisciplinary event like this. How did you get everybody here?
I told them there's beer.
There's beer. You didn't tell me there was beer. And one more thing. I do need to note that SWAT team that came and got me and took me to Princess Margaret, you better watch this guy. We're going to send the SWAT team. He was with us for quite a while, and it's great to see him flourishing here. Okay, so at the same time, I mean, the challenge has been recognized for many, many years in healthcare is that this is back in 1996. That was just after my PhD. That healthcare today is characterized by more to know, more to manage, more to watch, more to do, and more people involved than doing it at any time in the past. That's like 20 plus years ago. And now it's even more the case. And I know that the clinicians themselves are incredibly stressed about what's going on. There's like an entire initiative about the provider and the stress associated with dealing with all this information and everything moving forward. And it's, from a big picture perspective, I think from a healthcare perspective, we're seeing that we're recognizing that we're not very efficient at what we do. Some of our great science that we develop, aren't very good at actually converting it into evidence to show the value of that. And then once we do have some evidence, we don't necessarily use that evidence in the care, and then that care isn't exactly, perfectly delivered. And I'm not intending to depress everybody, but I think at the end of the day, it's nice to see someone say this out loud so we can all realize there's an opportunity for improvement. And we have to start thinking a little differently about the way we're working. It's always good to have a bit of a critical perspective. But this critical perspective also comes with some suggestions around how we could improve things moving forward. And this is the idea of moving to a system that learns, a learning health system. And this was presented by the Institute of Medicine. If you haven't had a chance to read this, it's pretty light reading, but it's pretty insightful, pretty engaging. And it talks about this really virtuous cycle that forms between the idea of delivering care, having observations in the process of delivering care, informing our science, using that to develop new methods and build new evidence, and then deliver care in a continuous cycle. And one of the things that's key in this is that you have communities of scientists and clinicians and practitioners. And what I've learned in the context of radiation medicine over the years, the physicists, the oncologists, and the therapists working together can do a lot when they're really fully collaborative, and every one of them has a contribution to the scientific agenda. And in particular, in the context of clinical trials, where it's really challenging to move the patients through the program, and getting that engagement is key. And so getting that thinking more in the context of the research opportunities we see here in London, and in the context of radiology, I think is the conversation that we're exploring. What's the way to do this in this new world where we're going to have evidence for what we want to do? We're going to want to collect information with new tools. Could we step back and rethink about how we collaborate? how we operate, how do we enable the power of imaging to have even more impact, because it is an amazing measurement system informing care. A key thing in this nice figure is the zeros and ones. And the zeros and ones, well, you know, it's digital, is that this digital piece really enables a lot. It really enables us to do a lot more than we could ever do before. And if you think about what we just saw today, which I didn't know about the VR stuff, I should look at the program, but the amount of information that's flowing, the amount of information that's now being collected, the density of data, the way we slice and dice the counts on the CTT system to optimize the resolution, optimize the SNR characteristics, the way we present the data, the way we have, you know, AI, I don't know if to say AI anymore, AI, and those elements all working for us, it's just getting more complex. And so we need to sort of think about what's the right way to work, how do we collaborate differently moving forward. I would think 30 years ago when I drove my Rabbit into London, it was a different world in many ways. The same problems, cure cancer, get the radiotherapy targets and things like that I worked on with many people here, but the world's changed. We should sort of step back and say, how do we work together? Could we work together differently? And it's, from a data perspective, it just keeps going. Now this is a bit old, this is 2015. I heard about the Bronto bite, was the phrase that came up today? This is the Bronto bite? No, that was a Bronto burger, so that's the Bronto bite. And the idea that the number of sensors moving forward by 2020 is some, 1 trillion sensors. This is old, 2015, I'm sure that number is much higher. The number of sensors in this room, and the mobile devices in this room, are much higher than the number of sensors we had at all in any of our imaging labs just 10, 15 years ago. So it's a dramatic increase in the amount of information. And it's really clear now, if you go look at the World Economic Forum presentations in the past couple of years, just the pounding message that technology is going to transform every business, whether it's blockchain, no one else said blockchain, I get a great beer, first person to say blockchain, blockchain, drinking game, how technology will transform healthcare. And we're challenged, this is by Klaus Schwab, he heads up World Economic Forum, and we'll be challenged again and again, and I think our question is, how do we think differently about collaborating given this technological change? And what Klaus writes in his book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, is that technology is not an exogenous force over which we have no control. We are not constrained by a binary choice to accept and live with it or reject and live without it. Instead, we should take dramatic technological change as an invitation to reflect about who we are and how we see the world. So the concept here is to sort of step back. If we had all the tools we have today, and we thought about how we were structured and how we were organized and how we collaborate, would we change that? Would we think about a different approach? And that's the kind of conversation I think is very helpful as we think about the roles we have in the context of collaboration amongst physics and oncology and radiology and RTs and industry as highlighted by Narendra. This is a recent publication from January 2018 in terms of the areas of healthcare that are in dire need for reform, recognized from across all parts of healthcare. And you'll note in the top right corner is where medical devices and diagnostics. They believe this is from a complexity of implementation and how constrained it is because it's locked in the way it is. And the importance for healthcare is also very high. So these are areas where we need to think dramatically about how we operate, how we work, how we make change moving forward. And this field is right up in the hot quadrant from a Gartner perspective. And so I think it's a very exciting time. So we're thinking about how we work differently in Toronto from an engineering, physics, and radiology collaboration perspective. And so we thought we would come here and stimulate the conversation a little bit. So I'm going to hand it over to Heidi for some of her comments and thoughts.
Well, I think I need a microphone. So the reason why we decided to appear kind of as a tag team is because we wanted to be a living example of the research in healthcare. If you want to be successful in research in healthcare, you need to have a communication and collaboration and partnerships between physicians, in our area here with radiologists, and the scientists on the other side. And really for both sides. What we saw today, the possibilities are endless. There are so many options out there. The developments with AI and machine learning, it's almost impossible to find out where to focus and where actually to concentrate your resources. So you need to find out what does the client need. And the client in this case is the physician, and in the end, it's the patient. So if you want to do research in healthcare and you want to be successful, you will only be successful if in the end it does improve patient care, more accurate diagnosis, faster diagnosis, less side effect, whatever it is. But also from the other way around, for physicians it's important that we go to meetings where studies are presented that we have no idea about, just to see, you know what, we had no idea that this is an option and we can actually use something like this. If Carl Benz would have asked people, what do you want from me? They would have said, well, we want faster horses, and nobody would have thought he could invent a car. So really, we need to see what's out there, and we need to have the bilateral communication. There is one other aspect that hasn't been brought up today and that I want to get into during my brief presentation. We heard earlier that the radiologist as such will not be obsolete. The radiologist who will not use AI will become obsolete. And I want to add to that the radiologist who stays in his room in the dark and does not go out and communicate with patients, with referring physicians, with researchers, that's a radiologist who will become obsolete. So again, bigger picture, step back. Where does every day technology and innovation impact our life meaning my life as a radiologist? And looking through the workflow, so we have a patient's going to the physician, primary care physician or specialist, they send them to radiology. The radiology, they do the imaging, we interpret the imaging, and we communicate the report back to the physician. And in every single level, we have constant innovation, and we are really dealing with that. We heard earlier about big data, about more and more images being produced. I see them every day. So all of these images are being produced, and they result in this huge amount of data pool. I see them, and I have to process them faster and still accurate, and I don't really get much help. So this is something, thanks to Dr. Paul, we're now doing in Toronto. So we've long came from morphology to function. And we have all of these cool functional techniques that we know about from neuroimaging, but we also have all of this dynamic imaging. So we looked at images, and now we look at phases of images. So here's just focusing on the trachea. Looks kind of fine, but then you see an expiration, see how it's narrowing. So it's useful. It's not that it's something that we cannot use for diagnosis, but it at least doubles the amount of time that we need to acquire the images and also to read the images. CT conversions, this is our immediate future. A lot of X-ray modalities, X-ray indications are right now being replaced by CT. X-ray, you look at it, you have a diagnosis. CT, you have to scroll through. Every radiologist knows it takes way longer to read an CT than an X-ray. But we know that, for example, in the immunocompromised population at Princess Margaret Hospital, if they want to rule out an infection, there's no point doing an X-ray because we don't see it. So for years, these patients are getting sometimes daily CT scans instead of X-rays. So this has been going on for quite a while already, and expanding to that. Another one of these kind of useless exams that we get is the abdomen in 2, sometimes 3 views for a patient with abdominal pain not yet diagnosed. So this is now the next big area of CT conversion, which we just started to do kind of these CT tomograms. Low-dose CT scans reconstructed with thick slabs and like scrolling MINIPs and MIPs, and we see the pathology much better than we would have seen with the much higher radiation that also was required for the conventional X-ray. So this is now starting, and this will replace conventional X-rays. Other areas, this is one of the examples where it's a kind of great idea, cool idea, but the added time and the added impact that it has for the radiologist does not really justify the added value is not necessarily there. There's a lot of the CAT application. CAT for lung nodules, for example, has been around for, I don't know, 10, 15 years, and it still is not taken off because it takes time. You can only use it as a second reader. And the added value, well, I see another tiny digital that I really don't want to know in the first place. And so we hardly ever use it. And I think the same fate will probably happen to the CAT for the detection of interstitial lung diseases. Unless there is really a true added value for patient care, we radiologists will be very reluctant to use that. Where we use post-processing is in areas like detection of lung nodules and scrolling MIPS. So we have a construction, cross-sectional images on the left and the scrolling MIPS on the right. And this is something we use now every day. But again, there's additional images, additional time, but we use this time to get a faster depiction of lung nodules that we otherwise wouldn't have seen. So there is the balance between the added time and the added value sufficient that we use that every day. At least for us in Toronto, the number of X-rays that we look at is kind of doubled from one time to the next when we upgraded our system. For portable films, we now get a so-called companion image. Post-process image that is kind of an edge enhancement, which allows us to see lines, bones, pneumothoraces, with a much higher sensitivity than on the conventional image. So we just now have 2 images to look at instead of 1. But we accepted that because the added time that we spent does justify, because we do get an added value and a much higher sensitivity in the detection of the abnormalities I just mentioned. And this is then just the kind of fancy stuff that we do partly because of the referring physician. So there's a small web in the trachea, probably would have been enough for the radiologist to make the diagnosis. So you see it on the video loop. You can do reconstructions, you can do giant reconstructions, you can do a virtual bronchoscopy, you can do a retrograde virtual bronchoscopy. This is actually the only added value that we would bring for compared to bronchoscopy, because we can look from the bottom of a stenosis back to a stenosis, and you can never do that with a bronchoscope. Again, a lot of images, a lot of time that we need to produce the images. This is a reconstruction that does require human intervention, and also additional time for reading for mediocre benefit. And it's really always the kind of cost-benefit analysis, is it worth doing it? Something like this looks beautiful, and we all have these images for textbooks and for talks. This is a thymoma that definitely was seen on the cross-sectional images, but for the surgeon to see it in a 3D view, that he knows the exact spatial relationship of the vessels with the tumor, this is an added value, and this is definitely worthwhile doing. Other scenarios, complex anatomy, we would, in these instances, do these 3D reconstructions. So this is just the data acquisition that has changed and is constantly changing our immediate future. What's also changing is the way how we interpret the images. We used to read images, now we're analyzing. Everything is kind of measured, the whole world is being measured. It's not good enough to say there is a density change, we have to give it in Hounsfield units. Everything has to be measured. The whole qualitative, it's increased, has been replaced by a quantitative approach. Textbooks, who still uses textbooks? I just moved into a new office and I even left all of my textbooks behind. That's been 2 months ago and I haven't really missed it. The internet is everywhere. More important, it used to be enough to make a diagnosis. And now we have diagnosis, would get one, let's say an oncology tumor would get 1 cycle of chemotherapy, and then yes, it's important if the tumor grows or not, but beyond that, it wasn't really much more information required. Now there is 2nd line, 3rd line chemotherapy, so not only do you need to differentiate the group of responders from the non-responders, you will also need to find the area that is responding from the area that is not responding, because we all of this sophisticated, personalized treatment that we heard earlier, but the demand on the image interpretation is changing. Social media for second opinion, it's everywhere. Interpretation, we have help because we have now additional information. We have eHealth Ontario, and from this publication that came over, this announcement that came out, London will be part of it. July 16th, we can look at each other's images. Not only images, also additional information on the patient's history. But the information has to be accessed, the information has to be processed. David will talk more about AI, so I can skip through that. And then I thought, communication. So where is my challenge with communication? And this was actually in the Globe and Mail just this Tuesday, a big article on fax machines don't belong into the 21st century healthcare. And I thought, this is where we are. So there is definitely a big move forward possible. So we need to get rid of faxing. We need to get into electronic transmission of reporting. Emailing if you do have a secure email address. But again, I would like to emphasize the additional approach, and I would like to really pause here. It's one way to think about the electronic experience and really getting reports electronically to physicians. Don't forget, we are humans. And this actually, in the end, will separate us from the encompassing AI radiologist that we heard about earlier. We can analyze and abstract and relate information that no AI will ever do. So we have to get out of our office and we have to go to the multidisciplinary conferences, and we have to be an active partner in the patient's discussion and the patient's management. And also do that with patients. Kind of we forgot that we are physicians, and a lot of radiologists hardly ever speak with a patient unless you are an interventional radiologist. There's no reason not to do that. So we do have an initiative, actually, it's called Meet a Radiologist, where patients can talk directly to us. There is an initiative to help the primary care physicians who kind of don't have the hallway conversations that the specialists have. And it's 1-800 imaging, just to bridge the gap. And we will have to deal directly with patients with the ongoing onboarding of patients portals that I understand will start here in London soon too. Getting back to David, just mentioning that we are physicians also involved in interventional treatment. Intervention, so it will be a long time till this tiny nodule can be reached by any kind of robot. And this is now the area where we again can combine with the science that we heard earlier. So it's the human who has the needle in the hand, combined with the images that provide us the exact localization of the tumor recurrence that needs to be treated. And these are the programs that will eventually have a huge impact on patient care and bring the field forward. So this is happening right now, the MRI-guided prostate brachytherapy program at Princess Margaret, which is really exemplifying the image-guided, personalized treatment of cancer care. And more from that now from David.
And I think the interesting point, as I sit and listen today, when we see these new methods being developed, I mean, the definition of success when I was sort of a grad student was, we're going to make a new imaging system, and it's going to become commercial, and some clinician's going to buy it, and they're going to use it. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing that the data flow is, much different. It's not a series of chevrons that connect together a product, it gets out there, it goes through a test, it's approved. The motion of the data, I mean, hearing how Heidi described how she uses the data differently than what the scanner was designed necessarily to do. The idea that we start to interact more closely with that information and maybe change our imaging system designs in a much more collaborative way. How we can bring additional information to the conversation to increase the value of the work that we're doing back to the organization. And I think with this digital everything domain that we're now moving into, we really need to think about having that information move much more through the organization. And I'll show in a few slides and emphasize why that's really becoming more and more the case. It's a little dark, here it comes. I mean, we benefit from these amazing measurement machines. But the idea that we just get a picture and then let someone else figure out how good that picture is and decide whether there's a value in that picture in a clinical practice seems to be a disconnect. Why not connect the design of the machines right back up to the person that's going to interpret it? Or if in the future, if it's an AI interpretation, why wouldn't the AI interpretation say, hey, this is the next measurement you need to make. And that feedback loop, I think, is what's coming forward in terms of the nature of data. And I think these are all Siemens developments. It's just such a nice slide. I put this out here just for Todd English's benefit. I don't know if he's still in the audience. But just highlighting how, I mean, the amount of information that's flowing off these things is enormous now. And multispectral from the point of view of CT, or multi-parametric from the point of view of MR, or fully dynamic, the richness of the data is enormous. I mean, and these systems, this is a little bit of work, a little bit of science I'm going to talk about. It's a project that we've been running for a number of years, which was to start to say, what's the best way to take an image of this patient? And this, just to illustrate the idea that, a concept that I refer to as sort of hypothesis-based imaging, and this is published by some of my grad students and myself and Jeff Sievertson, where rather than just make a CT scan of a patient, let's have a consistent dose and, you know, reasonable uniform exposure across the patient using a bow tie filter, what if we said, well, I only want to see this part of the patient. I don't really care about the SNR over there on that part of the patient. And it's possible, actually, to have CT systems work in this fashion, and we demonstrated the idea that you could have an estimate of the shape of the patient. I don't know what anatomy this is. This is why I work for Heidi. I made up that anatomy in PowerPoint. You can see it very clearly. But then you could say, I actually want a certain CNR in different parts of the image. And it's possible with CT methods to invert that and solve for the appropriate fluids patterns that you would apply from different angles to reconstruct it. Right now, we already suffer from non-uniform SNR across the CT scan because of variable attenuation. We can actually think about modulating the fluids we apply in generating the CT scan to make that more uniform if we want for uniform SNR, depending on the question we're trying to solve. The point being is that we can start to have the imaging systems change a little more dynamically in response to the problem we're trying to solve on a patient-by-patient basis. And so we did some theory on this and published it, and actually it's kind of hard to show, but this is the only physics part I'm showing, is that you can actually nicely control, while you maintain an image of an object, you can control where the SNR is, or the CNR in this context. And so you can manipulate the pattern of noise within the image while still recovering. The mean CT numbers are still there. That's not a problem, because it's modulated and demodulated by the patient. But you can see you can create different patterns of SNR. And if you take this further, CT is one story. MR is just the same story. Exactly the same story in terms of how you choose to excite and how you choose to distribute your power to achieve an objective. And this entire optimization space and imaging is sitting there, but to answer the question, you need to go right, to get the right image, you need to go right to the clinical question and take that all the way back. I think this is, really interesting. This problem with this, in all honesty, is you happen to have a modulator that can change the fluence at all angles as you rotate around the patient. Now, if you use optimization methods, I can say optimize, but I'm going to constrain the optimizer to say you're allowed to have one filter for all angles. That's a constraint on the optimization. It actually gives you an SNR pattern like this. This is for a 180 acquisition, which means you can kind of include the machine's constraints in the design of the fluence pattern. And so the whole time of experimenting more at that, but the point is it's actually possible to do this in a simple way. And what happens here is then the machines sort of kind of become hypothesis-based imaging systems. I'm looking for something. Do I have a clue I should look more? So I do a little bit of scanning, I put a little bit of dose in, and I look with a little more dose. But that feedback loop means we need to close the conversation between the person who's trying to solve it and how the imaging systems are built and designed. And I think this is going to become even more important as we move forward. The quantitative imaging space is also super important. The idea that we're going to derive a treatment, as we heard today on the theranostics, derive a prescription from a measurement in an image, that this number is calculated from that number, means that we need to turn these imaging systems into quantitative tools, measurement tools in the clinical setting. And in radiation oncology, this is becoming quite important. And we use CT to help design, but as we start to use multiparametric MR, we need to understand if we're going to classify that region of the body as disease. And that's going to be how we decide we direct the radiation to that part of the body. We don't want to have those parametric signals bouncing around from scanner to scanner. The idea that we contour a target versus we derive a target from measured quantitative signal, that's a lot more pressure. And if someone in the clinical setting is leaning on that, we need to know on the device side, that device is going to be able to stand up and perform. So the dependencies between the disciplines actually go up. Of course, there's AI, and I think what AI means now, it means automatic investment. I know I'm not supposed to say artificial intelligence. I heard that it was not the right thing to say anymore, machine learning, et cetera. But there's been a huge amount of investment, a ton of hype, and I think that's great. We'll see where that goes. And this is every radiologist's favorite person on the planet. This is Jeff Hinton, and I've heard him say several times that we don't need any more radiologists. I think he kind of says it in kind of a provocative fashion. I think that's great. He's a very interesting fellow. And actually, his original work, if you ever get a chance to read it, is back from '86, published in Nature, on learning representations by back projecting errors. And it's really interesting if you start to read through this paper how close it gets to the concepts of reconstruction and the way we do reconstruction. And the idea that we can solve for something from a set of measurements, which is very similar to classification and machine learning and deep learning methods, actually. It's really interesting to read the paper. I encourage you to do that. And of course, there's been a response to Jeff's comments. This one is from JAMA, which talks about adapting to artificial intelligence, radiologists and pathologists as information specialists. And the idea the discipline would shift. I'm not a radiologist or a pathologist, but I think just shifting to information experts is not really, where to go. I think there's a lot more that you could do. And I think the idea is to become, part of that full cycle of how those systems are designed, how they run, what question you're trying to solve. And that's why you want to have these broader conversations. I don't know, what do you think, Narinder?
I think it's going to be in a very exciting field as long as we embrace it and not learn from it.
Just like Kasparov. Just like Kasparov. The other interesting thing is that everybody started, these tools are coming into our space, and we heard about NVIDIA and GPUs. Now GPUs allow Jeff Hinton's, neural net platforms come to life. It's very interesting that NVIDIA now is realizing the impact of their technologies on healthcare to the point that they actually give out cancer research grants. You can actually write a proposal to them and they'll give you a GPU system. How many people in the room have actually got an NVIDIA GPU card from NVIDIA? A few of you? All right. You can, even Siemens has one, that's great. The idea here is that, there's a complete, this is weird. These are gaming cards that are funding now cancer research. Companies have made their money on gaming. I think that's pretty disruptive. We have to think differently. If the gaming companies are funding cancer research and enabling care, it's something weird's happening. We got to have fun. If you have a chance, if you really think that AI is a hype, here's another great piece of work that actually came out this January 2018 about how fast is AI progressing. It had this very nice introduction, and they highlight that it was back in 1956, a Dartmouth summer research project on artificial intelligence, that perhaps 2 months would be enough to make significant advances in the whole range of complex problems, including computers that can understand language, improve themselves, and even understand abstract concepts. 60 years later, it's coming. It's coming. We got Siri. This is great. The interesting thing, I think, from an imaging perspective, is how this is completely crashing over into radiology. And this is a really simple example. This is from 2016, where if you take a bunch of pictures from different angles, it reconstructs a chair using deep learning methods. It's not so crazy. Take a bunch of x-rays from different angles of the patient, it reconstructs the patient. Well, we use a different method. We use filtered back projection or reconstruction methods. But this paradigm where, the idea that we're reconstructing something from a whole bunch of measurements, which somehow we can correspond reasonably well because I got a $200 phone, is, hey, that's our space. That's 3D imaging space. What do you guys, stay over there. This is medical imaging world, but in fact, it's just coming full on. They ain't going to stop the gamers. They're coming right across. And so we should embrace the gamers. We should engage them and participate with them. But there's an entire article. I don't know if you follow G-Wang's work. He's at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he's got a very nice couple summary articles on IEEE transactions and access about, in the past, we had the idea that we would have, more of a traditional analytical reconstruction, then we went to iterative methods, and now from a reconstruction perspective, just going to full deep learning methods. And this is in CT. It's already there in MR, a whole bunch of presentations next week at ISMRM on the use of deep learning methods and CNNs for reconstruction and MR also coming forward. And so the two of them are just back and forth, sparse methods for reconstruction. And I think this is going to be, a really interesting combination and collaboration space. And this just highlights, how these methods can actually generate, really manage the presence of noise. Is it still accurate in the reconstruction? These are all the validation questions that we still have to work through. But this idea that we have, methods over here that are coming completely across and changing the way we generate images, I think is really interesting. But then you could say, well, why generate the images? Maybe we should just, analyze the data that comes off the images. We only generate the images so we can use our eyes to interpret them. There's always compromises as soon as we add things and filter and add. What about just, work with the raw data? We're finding that there's stuff in the raw data or the reconstructed data that we don't even notice that could be important. So maybe we should think about just work with the raw data. This is disruptive, I think. Okay, so here, this is the radiomics paper that many of you may have seen. Hugo Ertz from Maastricht. He's now in Boston. His paper from 2014, and the idea that you could look at lung tumors or head and neck cancer tumors with lung tumors here, for example, and you could pull out features that we understand, like the intensity, the shape. Okay, that would definitely be qualified from radiology. Some texture parameters and some wavelet components. We can feed those radiomic features and clinical data and gene expression and come up with remarkable classification schemes just based on those texture elements within the images, deciding differently in terms of a survival probability in these patients. And so this is a very hot topic. Who hasn't worked on radiomics or read radiomics? Who's working on radiomics in the audience? I think everybody's got on radiomics. Okay. And the idea here, though, is that there's this sort of subtle element in the image. It doesn't even matter what that signal means. It's the fact that it's a biomarker that can help make us decision is really becoming a very hot topic in the field. So we became very interested in this, and because I'm just sort of suspicious that there's this underlying signal that we don't know where it's coming from, but it's going to change the diagnosis for a patient in terms of the predicted outcome. So what we did is we met with Hugo, and he produced a nice code that's open source, Python-based code, and we adopted it, and we started to apply his methods to our data sets to see whether they produce the same results. And this was a little awkward, because when we started to do that, we started to see some things which would make you ask some questions around the idea that how we're analyzing this data from an automated perspective. So we put together this pipeline where we can compare the data. We understood the algorithms very carefully because now it was open source, and we applied it, and we applied it to some of our own data. In this case, head and neck cancer data sets. And this is a little movie I can show to you. It's a little bit mislabeled, but you'll get the idea. In a second. I'm looking. There it is. So you can just apply the predictive index that was derived from this radiomic signatures that he had, the texture values, the volume was included, a whole bunch of 4 or 5 different factors would generate this PI value, and the PI value is falling. And as the PI value falls, you start to go from a negative, like a poor outcome classification, to a good outcome classification. So you can see the ones above the 0.2, negative 0.2, they do better than the ones below. And this is just the extracted predictive index for each of those patients based on those 5 or 6 parameters that he had published. And it's really interesting if you start to look at where they are in time and survival, it's quite interesting. But one or two of those factors in there is the volume of the tumor. Some of it is the texture. So I said to my student, well, let's run it again, and let's just take out everything except the volume. And so we did that. And on the volume analysis alone, I think my mouse is still here. Of course, this is just volume. There's no fancy predictive index. Basically, the summary is pretty simple. We got the same concordance index just using volume. And what's pretty clear is that when we start to have these kinds of signals, these subtle things that we can't read with the human eye, they can actually have an effect in terms of the predictive component, but it's not necessarily robust and reliable. And it wasn't until we were able to take a very close look at those algorithmic methods, reproduce them in an open source platform, rerun them on our own platform, that we could realize that in fact, some of those subtle volumes, those sort of texture signals, had volume signal leaking over into them. And that was affecting the result. Because one of these factors is energy, and energy was a texture change over a volume. So the bigger the volume, the more energy there was. So if you have to do the normalization, be very careful on these things. So then we went a little further. Now this was a little bit brutal. It's in review for publication right now. And Hugo is a member of the authorship list, okay? Just so I didn't break anybody's trust here. We said, what if we just take all the voxels inside those 3D regions of interest and randomize them? Completely scramble their position. We did that too. And lo and behold, the C index is 0.62. So there's a lot of sensitivity in terms of these kinds of tools, in terms of we don't really understand where the signal's coming from. There could be a lot of risk. And so we published it now and headed into the Green Journal. We'll see if they accept it. But the point being is that we've now identified a set of safeguards we need to put in place to make sure that the signal that's being interpreted is actually robust. So radiomics, we don't know if it'll be huge. But what I did realize, and I think it's really important to realize, is that, and we wrote in this editorial, is that is it a new world or another road to El Dorado? The interesting thing is the new world part is not the fact that there's maybe this texture in it. The most interesting thing is that with the tools we have today, we can automatically mine information out of information that's otherwise considered discarded. And there's no way we could even explore to see if a radiomic signal was reasonable in the past. We never had it enough in one place. We never had it compiled enough where we could read it together. We never had the computational resource to go and explore this piece. And it brings this whole idea that all that data that's pouring in front of Heidi every day is available for us to now start to mine. And that automation piece is incredibly powerful. And that automation piece could inform us about what the next machine could be. If we found that texture in the image was the most important thing, then Aaron, make us a texture imaging system, if that's the most important thing. We don't need those DC signals. What price do we pay for those DC signals? The idea that we start to get on to the critical, valuable part and feed that back into what we build from an imaging system perspective, I think is really, really powerful. That feedback loop becomes key. The interesting thing here is that, I mean, the automation allows us to pursue some other interesting things. I don't know if anybody knows, bacon. Everybody hear of bacon? It's one of my favorite foods. But it's also three elements: barium, cobalt, and nitrogen. My daughter has a shirt that says barium, cobalt, and nitrogen. Bacon, I love it. Anyway, so bacon is quite old. But he proposed a model for discovering which relevant observations about a specific phenomena are systematically collected, tabulated, objectively analyzed using inductive logic and science. Basically, he proposed science. And the reality is that we're very biased. But with these automated methods, we could start to really explore and remove bias from what we're doing and everything we're pursuing. And there's an entire conversation now on automated science emerging, which I think is really interesting because I'm sure there's quite a few PhDs who spend a lot of their life moving data from one drive to the other and clicking things over and over and over again. We'll stop doing that. That stuff will all get automated. But the idea we start to feed back the information that Heidi's adding to the images and use that to design the images of the future, I think is extremely exciting. And this actually is nothing wrong with this. Is that the idea that we pursue prognostics or looking for biomarkers, or we pursue what's called etiological research, which is research that explores meaning and understanding. The two of them can live perfectly happily together. And the data starts to move, and hypotheses emerge out of observation, just like that radiomic signal did. And sure, it has to be tested. And the idea that we can start to tie a loop between this incredible data flow in radiology and back to the design of the imaging systems, this I think is a fantastic opportunity. And so what we've been sort of starting to think about is how do we make all this data move together? How do we start to think about all the features that are coming off of image sets? How do we tie that to the tissue features, to the intervention features, to the outcomes features, and start to think about kind of a different kind of machine that lets this data flow together? where big data travels together, meaning is present, we can manage the data, we can do large-scale initiatives, and we also understand the quality of the data, and we start to learn across the entire clinical context. And at the end of the day, whether the feature is a texture or a shape or an outcome or its uptake of a theranostic marker or the clinical outcome from that result, these features become things that can feed into that architecture of machine learning, which was brought to us by Jeff Hinton and the gamers, which I think is a really interesting, powerful view that we should start to think about leveraging moving forward as a collaborative discipline. And it's not just us. There are groups now thinking about taking these kinds of big machine paradigms and running them distributed across the globe, accessing features from different sites and drawing them together with the same kind of principles and learning faster and faster. So we wouldn't have the same situations we had with Hugo Ayers, where he studied on his one set and we studied on our set and found two different answers. Instead, we do that in a collaborative fashion. So, I mean, this is a lot further apart than Toronto to London. Toronto to London is like right there. It's a lot closer. We could definitely figure out how to collaborate and share data, and we do have great projects together. And I think there's many more opportunities. I'm going to stop there and hand it off to Heidi to wrap it up.
I'm allowed the last word. So I think what we learned from essentially the entire day today, and also from the last talk, we have to envision our future. I think in some ways we can envision better than others. They are a little bit further away. But it is really only what we say in the title, the collaborative practice, the science and the technology that will move us forward. And we have to drive it together. And if change is there, adopt the change. Make the change use for the narrow indication and use the energy that is freed up to have creative idea. And, you know, don't forget, we are humans. And use this human factor creatively, use the science. And I'm pretty sure if we're here in a few years, we will see where we have been going. Thank you very much.